you by the Recruitment Process Outsourcing Association. Our topic for today is letting go, how to make the most from RPO. My name is Lamis Awrama. I have the honor of being RPO's Executive Director, and I'll be your host today. I'm very pleased to be joined by our leadership presenters, Andy Rohn and Matt Rivera with Yo, who prepared an engaging and dynamic presentation for us. Before we dive into our presentation, I'd like to share a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the RPOA Leadership Forum page and on Yo's website. If you have questions during the event, please post them to the chat panel on your GoToMeeting portal. I will be passing these along to our speakers at the end of the presentation. We also want to improve our events, and you can help us by sharing your feedback. By the end of this presentation, you will be prompted for a quick survey. Please take a minute to let us know how we did. And now I have the privilege of introducing our speakers. Andy Rohn, Vice President of Recruitment Process Outsourcing for Yo. As Vice President of Recruitment Process Outsourcing, Andy is responsible for driving the strategic direction as well as leading the delivery of Yo's RPO business. Andy brings more than 15 years of human capital industry experience to the role, including 6 years as Vice President of Operations for PeopleScout, where he led RPO engagements with Fortune 500 companies. He also served as Managing Partner of ITB Recruiting, a sales and IT recruiting firm, and developed new sales channels in his role as Vice President of Sales for Monster.com. Our second presenter is a recurring speaker at the RPOA Leadership Forum, and we're happy to have them both. Matt Rivera is currently the head of marketing at Yo. Matt has 25 years of experience in the staffing and workforce management industry. He has worked in virtually every aspect of contingent labor and recruitment outsourcing, from local branch operations and implementations to corporate marketing for Yo. As head of marketing, Matt helps develop innovative workforce solutions to help clients achieve maximum return and efficiencies from their use of Yo's services. He is also a frequent blogger and speaker on recruiting, marketing, and workforce solutions. So Andy and Matt, we're thrilled to have you both. And without further ado, I'd like to pass this presentation over to you.
Great. Thank you, Lamis. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. Thank you, Andy. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks, Matt.
All right, good. Well, we're happy that you joined us today. We hope that we can provide some insight to you. Andy and I are going to take a few minutes here to go through. We only have about 7 or 8 slides here. We don't have a lot of slides. We've got a lot of great information. If you do have questions, as Lamis said, go ahead and type those out, and we'll take those at the end. And we'd love to answer some questions. So we're going to speak for a little while, and then at the end we'll take questions. Andy, is one of the most knowledgeable people I've met on RPO, so I'm excited to get to talk to him today about all the great stuff that he's experienced as a leader and as our leader at Yo for our recruitment process outsourcing practice. So I think let's get started, Andy. Where would you like to start?
Well, let's flip to the first slide and let's really set the stage in terms of really what we're going to talk about today in terms of letting go and how to optimize your relationship with an RPO partner. And one of the things that I like to do, Matt, is really start with the definition of RPO, because I think this sets the stage. It gives us a baseline from where our discussion is going to go. But if you look at the definition in front of you, let me read it to you. The transfer of ownership of all or part of a recruitment process or activities on an ongoing basis in order to achieve process and cost optimization. The key here in terms of letting go and getting the most out of your RPO engagement is really around that first part of the definition, which is about transfer of ownership. And Lee Iacocca said, "I hire people brighter than me, and then I get out of the way." And what Iacocca is doing here is demonstrating great leadership. He's turning traditional employment management and control on its head in order to realize greater outcomes. And if he stops controlling and allows his hires to execute based on their experience and expertise, he's going to actually achieve those outcomes. Now, the key to this is, and really what goes unsaid, is that certainly Iacocca is controlling the outcomes. His new hires may have the discretion to execute, but the outcomes of their effort and the goal attainment must be reached. So Iacocca has moved away from tactical control to controlling of the outcomes. And what we know here is that there's certainly governance, reporting, and key performance indicators which give Iacocca insight into whether his lieutenants are on track to reaching their goals. So really the key here is, and one of the key themes, is around control. And hiring an RPO is not unlike hiring your next RPO. Hiring an RPO is not unlike hiring your next employee. You need someone with the exact experience necessary and someone with great character. And then you need to set this person on the right course to execute and reach your goals. So likewise, when you hire an RPO, you need to set the course with your RPO partner. And like Iacocca, you need to get out of the way. But you also need to balance this with program checks to ensure the RPO is reaching their goals. And that's, again, what we're going to talk about today. It's natural for many individuals to not let go and to want to be involved in every step of the process. But your RPO partner can help provide direction and information, which is going to allow the client side to get away from tactical and truly understand how they can control things from controlling the outcomes.
Excellent.
So today we're going to...
So you talked about a couple things there, right, that we see here, which is control and optimization and some of those things. So I actually went one slide beyond, or actually I got the slides out of order because we did intend to start with that kind of definition, but I think what you set up really well too was what we're going to go over today. So we gave you the real definition that Andy talked about and really foreshadowed most of what we're going to talk about today. So when we talk about RPO and we get into this idea of letting go and how you might let go and some of those great things that we were talking about with Lee Iacocca there, it's, are you ready for RPO? And how do you know when you're ready? And then now when you're setting up that partnership, what does it mean to set up that partnership? And then, why letting go can give you more control. However, as you noted, there's checks and program checks in place to make sure that things are getting done and that you're getting the type of results that you're looking for. So that's done and accomplished through metrics and SLA. So, it's really pertinent to everything we're talking about. So thanks for starting with that definition and checking me there. So, I think that gets us really off on a good path. And what I'd say for everybody listening is a couple things to listen for. I like to give people a couple things to listen for as we're going through something like this. And one of the things is think about the concept of trust here. Obviously, it's implied, but there's a lot that goes along with that, right? You have to have things in place to set up that trust and that trusting relationship, and we're going to talk about those in the partnership and those things. And then the idea of accountability. And a lot of these things come together in accountability when we're talking about how we're going to accomplish, who's responsible for accomplishing these things first, how we're going to accomplish them, and then who's going to be held accountable to that. So I think there's a lot of great stuff in there. So let's, why don't we jump into, how do you know, Andy, when you're ready for RPO? How do you know, your company is ready, and what do we need to know?
Well, I think, Matt, as you look at this slide right here, there's a number of things that are listed which every company should take into consideration to determine their readiness. And addressing these aspects of your business will prepare you and your company for the RPO partnership to come. Set the right course from the beginning of your relationship. the other thing is that the RPO partner should also be able to help you navigate through these aspects, typically during the implementation period.
Right. So you're not alone, even when you're starting out, right? You're not, that's part of a good way to start that relationship, right?
Yeah, they give you the guidance necessary to ensure that the evaluation in terms of the company's readiness is on target, and typically not every company is exactly ready at that particular point in time, but then what do you need to shore up in order to get ready?
Yeah, and I think that's
ready.
a really good point, right? Because I think, maybe there's some perception out there that, well, I'd have to know everything and get everything together before I even approach an RPO provider, and even start this when, really it would be a good conversation to have as you're kind of thinking about what the right thing is for your company, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so
exactly.
So why don't we get into culture a little bit? What about culture do we need to know, and how big a question is, culture in this whole idea?
Well, within culture, I think, you have to understand how your company deals with change. I also think another thing, when you talk about culture, what comes to the forefront is really regarding departmental interaction. Success of an RPO relationship involves so many different, you can call them departments or individuals, but so many different entities have a real role in the success of the overall program and partnership. So asking yourself questions like, how do distinct internal departments interact today, and what's your company's history of dealing with shared services such as IT or HR? Most companies have a centralized or some sort of shared service or shared talent acquisition support structure. And so in order to assess your cultural readiness, you need to ask yourself, how do our hiring managers and talent acquisition team members interact today? What are the recruitment process expectations of the hiring managers? How would you actually describe that relationship today? And if there's governance put in order to manage those relationships, what are they, if anything? I think an RPO partnership, which involves direct engagement with hiring managers, can improve a broken or stressed hiring manager-talent team relationship. But typically, without solid talent acquisition leadership support or executive sponsorship, it's not going to work. So a successful RPO provider understands that successful RPO relationships, the one-on-one relationships, are at the core of a successful partnership. What this means is that HR or talent acquisition leaders need to support this relationship through their support of the RPO partnership in exactly the same way that they'd support an internal talent acquisition team. I think, in addition, the current talent acquisition staff needs to have really clearly defined roles, direction, focus on the support of the entire recruitment process also. Too often what we see is the current staff sees an RPO partner as a threat to their job security. And so from this perspective, the typical behavior is that they attempt to undermine the RPO. And undermining the RPO means undermining the process, the program, and perhaps the corporate business outcomes, which obviously
so in that, kind of in the realm of that, right, when you're talking about, getting everybody on the same page and understanding, those relationships and the possibility of that threat, where, we've talked a lot about some of the things on here about the current staff and things like that and the culture. So, talk a little bit more about it. Tell us a little bit more about, the importance of, the executive leadership and the talent acquisition leadership in doing this. How important really is that as you go through this process?
Well, so think about this. Again, I just mentioned a second ago how important it is for the talent acquisition leaders to support the RPO partnership like they support their internal team. But executive support really takes things to the next level. And so not unlike any other corporate initiative or strategy, the transition of an RPO partner needs this leadership and support. Executive leaders, they need to bring distinct teams together, clarify the strategy, define the roles and responsibilities, and gain buy-in and support. This is really important and impactful on hiring managers. So too often, hiring managers don't understand the critical role that they play in the success of the talent acquisition team, be that with or even without an RPO partner. You know, we started out discussing and drawing parallels between hiring an RPO partner and hiring your next employee. Well, likewise, we all know the benefits of setting up your new employee for success. Similarly, setting your RPO partner up for success through executive support is critical to all teams, the talent acquisition team, HR, hiring manager, and the RPO partner, so that they're all working as one team. The leaders of most RPO engagements understand the importance of defining roles and responsibilities, and typically the process is laid out to a T. However, typically the audience addressed is that frontline, hands-on talent team and RPO team. And this team is addressed because these are the groups that are controlled by the HR and talent leaders. Yet typically the greatest impact on the success of the talent acquisition process, and perhaps the one that's most overlooked, is the impact that is made by the hiring managers. Executive and departmental sponsorship of the RPO engagement, which gains buy-in and partnership from the hiring managers, is much more likely to lead to success.
Wow. So, you know, I think one of the things that kind of hit me as you were talking about that, I think that, you know, we talk about executive support, you kind of think that, you know, really just means from the top down, or, you know, other, you know, maybe other solutions or other things you might do kind of where the hiring managers are a little bit more in control or HR is a little more controlled and whatever. You know, you just focused on the top and the bottom there and getting the executive managers bought in, but also, you know, understanding the role they play and the hiring managers play in the success of this, and the relationships, you know, relationships that a company has is really interesting, because I think that, you know, a lot of companies think that RPO is kind of imposed upon them, and there's going to be this
That's exactly right.
layer that's just going to kind of sit on top, and everybody's just going to kind of do their own thing like they used to, and the RPO is just going to take care of things. But what you really kind of, you know, talking about there is how it integrates into all the, you know, the different roles and the relationships that happen within a company, and how that contributes to the success of the program.
Exactly.
So really, really cool stuff in there. So that's good. Now, a couple of the other things here that we just to touch on briefly is that, you know, in readiness, you know, you talk about the organizational changes and business changes. You know, there's times when, you know, that it makes sense and maybe not make sense, and how you create that burning platform. But I think, you know, the key takeaways there, you know, are those relationships and how we deal with those. So let's move on to my newest favorite slide, just for the picture. And this is, you know, about the partnership. So we talked about in the definition, you know, optimizing, you know, the processes and achieve a process and cost optimization. So what are the most important things about the partnership and defining these roles and responsibilities that are going to get us that success?
So a little bit beyond the roles and responsibilities, one of the things that I think is commonly accepted is that top-performing companies understand that recruiting is everyone's job. These companies typically embrace and maximize employee referrals because they understand the exponential value to the company of the relationship between the referring employee and the new hire. A real quick side note, our entire organization at Yo recently read the book, The Oz Principle. And if you haven't read it, the concept behind the Oz Principle is about how powerful personal and organizational accountability is for any company. And one of the many messages which stood out in this book is how a culture of accountability by everyone fills the structural gaps in an organization. So think of this. So no organization is structured perfectly, and certainly, because we're talking about partnerships, no partnerships are structured perfectly. So with this perspective and embracing the odds principle, we can ensure to minimize problems and those things which can fall through the gaps. And so to this end, when we think about structuring roles and responsibilities between a client organization and an RPO partner, it's important to understand and get executive support on the concept of accountability throughout the organization. So without beating the dead horse, the reality is that executive sponsorship is really important and accountability is really important. So now if you start with that baseline, certainly the roles will be defined by the developed solution. And since, part of what defines RPO is that each solution is customized, then the roles and responsibilities will be unique to the organization that's actually being served. That said, the two most important roles within an RPO engagement are the operational leaders representing the client and the RPO provider. So the operational leader representing the client typically has a title such as Director of Talent Acquisition, and this person is close enough to the day-to-day operations of the business, but also has strategic vision and P&L responsibility. And this person understands the value of the RPO program and is clear about the specific deliverables of that RPO engagement.
Right, and again, we talked a little bit about this, right? Having those, having everybody kind of, understanding and those relationships that happen within a company. So it sounds like this person, this role of this, operational leader is pretty important. So, give us what were some more details about this client side operational leader that helps with this partnership and that role.
Yeah. So the client-side operational leader is attached at the hip to the RPO operations leader. And the RPO partnership, both sides, client side and the provider side, look to these two leaders for strategic direction as well as how the overall teams will partner. These two people set the tone. The healthier this relationship is, the better the overall partnership. In addition to setting the tone, the client-side operations leader is the person who must understand how to let go, how to set the strategic direction, and then, as Ayako said, get out of the way. Now, again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. In order to get out of the way, a set of key performance indicators, service level agreements, and reporting and program goals must be set in order to ensure that program goals can be attained. And when you think about it, one can't simply let go and be totally out of control, but it's what you control that makes the difference. So trust and letting go can be achieved through RPO performance combined with clear reporting and communication on outcomes.
Right, and there you said it, right? So again, going back to a couple of those things I said earlier on, trust, is kind of one of those things that you're starting to see now and developing and talking about the readiness concept, and now here we're in the partnership, talking about partnership. Having that trust is important, and you're kind of building that. And I think that what you described, what I heard you describe earlier, as we're talking about readiness, is in talking about how ready your organization is. You're starting to build that trust, and you're building that trust throughout your organization, not just assuming it's going to happen in that way. And we talked about the executive role in that, right? So just, I know we talked about this before a little bit, but talk about like the specifics of the executive's role, just a couple of things that, to be aware of, that might be a little more specific to what the executive's role might be in this.
Yeah, and again, we probably can't touch on this too much, and that's why, the slide says, do we already say that? The executive's role is typically broken down into two categories: strategic direction, which is a role that they actually share with the director side on the client side, and executive sponsor. The key to this portion of the role is really to ensure that all internal departments, specifically non-HR, non-talent teams, those teams out of direct control of the director, are fully aligned with the goals of the corporate talent acquisition program. So think about it. Hiring managers have, quote unquote, their day job. And the reason why there's even a shared talent acquisition team is because it's allowing those hiring managers to do the job that they were hired to do. But they need to also understand their impact on the role, their impact in their role on the success of the entire talent acquisition program. The executive directive to these teams will support this effort. Ultimately, the executive is the connection between the talent acquisition team and its role in ensuring the business reaches its corporate goals. So both proactively and in some cases reactively, the executive needs to address the business as a whole regarding corporate alignment, how it relates to talent acquisition.
Right. So, you know, I think, yeah, like you said, I mean, the key thing right there is to, you know, make sure you have that and make sure that things are aligned. And I think alignment's another thing here that we've that's just kind of underlying this discussion today when we're talking about it, is having that alignment and working on that alignment from the very beginning. And now we've, you know, talked a little bit about the roles and things, you know, who's in charge and what we're trying to do and the key stakeholders. But what about feedback? And then, you know, some changes, if there are any changes that need to be made to the program, you know, with these roles. How's that going to work?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that communication in the form of key performance indicators or service level agreements, reports, are a few of the ways in which the client-side operation leader can ensure the program's on track. That's, you know, that is the key feedback mechanism. In addition, hiring manager feedback also plays a significant role in understanding the success of the program. You know, how they feel the program is actually going. And I use the word feel. We also want, you know, empirical data, but their perspective is truly their perspective, and it has to be taken into account. And there has to be a formalized mechanism to solicit that information. But the client-side operation leader is the person who should be evaluating the program-level feedback. And typically, based on this information, this person can course-correct, redirect, make necessary changes to the program. It's common for, you know, both the partnership and the process to be dynamic and evolve over time. So these are not things that are static. You know, if the talent acquisition team is actually doing their job, they're going to push for continuous improvement and innovation. Separate things, but they're going to constantly pushing the envelope to achieve better results and greater alignment with the overall business or corporate goals.
Mm-hmm. And I think you hit on one thing that's really important to note there too, is just, you know, go in with that expectation that there is going to be, you know, that there are going to be changes as it evolves over time. So it's, you know, it's not something you put in place. It's intended to be static, and, you know, as your business changes or something changes, that you kind of have to live with the way it's set up. It's that feedback and you know, making sure you're aligned with the goals of the organization, and as they, you know, kind of evolve over time, the program evolves over time, and that can be pretty powerful too. I would assume as you go through, because, you know, you're not going to know everything about everything when you first go into, you know, any company, and things can change. So that makes total sense. All right. Well, I hate to navigate away from the slide because I'm still enjoying that picture, but let's go into. Let's talk about, you know, the other thing I mentioned earlier up front was accountability, and you know, I guess the main question is why do I need to let go? Why does a client need to let go when RPO comes in? What's kind of what's most important with this when I think about the idea of letting go?
Well, so again, using the reference to Lee Iacocca, he said that letting go or getting out of the way and it is key, and it's really a different way of managing outcomes versus managing tactical operations. It's a more strategic approach in perspective. And so this approach provides actually the RPO partner with the ability to execute based on their experience to bring their best practices to the program. Using the analogy used earlier of comparing the selection of an RPO partner to the selection of a high-level employee, you know, you wouldn't hire an individual with subject matter expertise only to tell them every single day each tactical step that they should take. So likewise, the selection of an RPO partner is based upon the RPO's expertise. Their success and experience is based upon their abilities to execute a talent acquisition strategy in the most effective and efficient manner possible. So managing an RPO's actions instead of managing their outcome really hamstrings the RPO's ability to execute at the highest level and bring success to that client. It hamstrings their ability to actually bring speed to the entire process.
That's, it kind of brings up the idea of, when you were talking about selection of a high-level employee, if you're going to hire somebody at a high level like that and then completely micromanage them, that person's likely not going to get anywhere. And the question becomes, why did you hire them in the first place? You need to, give them, where the direction and those types of things, and let them go. So, yeah, I mean, can you give us an example of how maybe letting go or not letting go, benefits the client, or how that really kind of works, and what's the most important thing when you're talking about letting go, or why you should let go?
Yeah. So I mentioned speed just a second ago, and so much of talent acquisition is based on speed. So much of talent acquisition today and the way companies approach things is reactive. And so there's always that struggle of trying to get in front of those things. And, typically the problem comes down to from a strategic standpoint, what is a company willing to do in terms of investment in order to get ahead of the curve and perhaps in some cases pipeline talent in anticipation of growth or turnover. But if the RPO partner is clear about the outcomes that they are accountable to produce, they're going to naturally course correct when the process is not on target. And this course correction happens at the micro level, the individual level, the recruiter level, so and even possibly on a day-to-day basis when it comes to sourcing the right talent. The speed to evaluate results and then quickly course correct is much quicker than the tactical execution if it was directed by the client. A process which is directed by the client truly is owned by the client as opposed to owned by the RPO. And the implications of this is that when the directed process by the client is failing, the recourse means both teams must come together, scratch their heads, and say, how are we going to make this better? And this takes time. What you want to do is empowerment.
Yeah, a lot of time gets sucked up in that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be. So what's a good example of that? Give us like an example of a real-world example.
Well, so, a typical type of example would be, let's say for, again, example purposes, the client tells the RPO how to source, and it says, hey, prior to you coming in, we've had a lot of luck using, and again, hypothetical, Monster's resume database to find candidates. And so we want you to go use Monster's database as well. And so now the RPO is required to, okay, one, spend sourcing money against it, spend sourcing time against using Monster. Yet the RPO actually could have came to the table with a much more sophisticated and efficient means for finding candidates. Now they could actually, they could do it in parallel and actually execute both. But at some point, following that directive, when it may not be the best course of action, may actually be using resources or, again, actually costing something to either the RPO or the client. Anyway, in this scenario, if they follow the client's directive, they're tied to following orders. When outcome fails to meet the expectations, both the client and the RPO fail. Yet had the RPO executed on their best practice, the outcomes of their effort would dictate their next actions. So that could be both positive and negative, but perhaps they may need to add more resources, or they need to pull back, or take an entirely new path. In a situation in which the RPO is able to execute on the tactics, their hand is firmly on the governor. They're evaluating their feedback on that micro level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's right. When we're starting to kind of get into, the meat of what we're talking about with letting go here. It's those types of things. I think that was a great example, and probably a real, an example that, as an RPO provider, we run into all the time when you do that. And when you don't let them do that, like you said, you're hamstringing. When you do let them do that, you're leveraging now their best practices. And if there needs to be course correction, that's fine, or different actions. But you're allowing them to take control and to put their hands on the wheel and drive. And I think that's when we're talking about letting go, you're doing some of that in a different way. So talk about like how does a client know? Maybe I don't know. It's hard to get it. You don't want to get into to a level of detail here. We don't have time to get into real deep into the details. But how does a client know what to let go of in order to facilitate the best results, or the results you're trying to get?
Yeah, usually the best way is to really understand the expertise of each entity in the partnership. So the RPO team is an expert in talent acquisition and talent acquisition process. The client obviously knows themselves and is an expert in their corporate goals, expected talent acquisition outcomes, corporate culture, values, the candidate's ideal profile, corporate brand. So knowing this, the RPO provider should come to the engagement with a set of recommendations based on best practices for workflow and process. The client should provide the guidelines, based on their expertise, so that they can then communicate to the RPO what path to follow. Not what to do, but here are the guidelines. The values, and the key word here is values, of the client are going to dictate the communication, which can take the form of reporting, needed to satisfy the client's understanding of the execution of the process and the results, and going back to the word that you talked about earlier, Matt, trust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems really clear, and so hopefully it's becoming clear to everybody out there when we're talking about, the idea of trust. And the one thing we didn't have when we're talking about readiness is this idea of, the values of the client. And it seems like, that's important. So coming into a partnership, or, if you're a client thinking about using RPO as one of your recruiting strategies, is that you understand how it works into, the values of your organization, and that, speaks to one, readiness for it and how it's going to work within there, but two, when you're into the partnership and you're talking about it, that, that is your kind of your part in that control. You don't lose that part of it. You're actually, what you just described was, really what the client is controlling, some of those aspects of the values and their branding and the things that their corporate culture that really helps to drive, what the RPO is doing, but not specifically, like you said, the day-to-day things that the RPO is doing. But okay, so we've been talking about a lot of the aspects that are around how we set this up and the partnership, and talking about how it works. So what we'd like to do now, what we thought we'd spend a little bit of time here towards the end, is talking about just getting a little bit specific for a moment, because the question now really always comes up when we're talking about this as well. When you're talking about how you manage accountability and how you're managing this, and the control you do have as a client in this type of situation, and what types of accountability you will have, it brings up the question of metrics, SLAs, KPIs, things like that. And so let's talk about. Let's maybe start with reporting. Maybe we'll talk about some of the most important reports or SLAs, but let's kind of dive into a little bit of the metrics and SLAs, and talking about what's important here with some of these things with reports and SLAs.
Yeah, so I think I think where I left off last was focusing on values, and you touched on it as well. And so the most important reports and SLAs are the ones which measure the things that are of the highest value to the client. So this typically comes down to, in almost every talent acquisition program, is quality as well as efficiency. And so these things manifest themselves in reports which show time to fill and time to start, time to offer on the process side. On the quality side, it could be interview to offer ratio, hiring manager satisfaction, candidate experience. Again, the key to good reporting is understanding the values of the client. these things that client values will dictate not only what's in the report, but the frequency and the type of detail. Let me give you a real quick example. If you think about interview to offer ratio, so how many interviews will it take the hiring manager to actually make a decision to make an offer? It's a really good barometer of candidate quality. But it also could mean so much more if it's broken out by recruiter, by job category, by division, or by hiring manager. So all that said, there is an ultimate analysis, which is the link between talent acquisition results and business results. So you hear a lot of people talking about big data these days and how to actually understand the throughput of talent acquisition results and how that's impacting the business. As reporting functionality becomes a lot more sophisticated, the connection between these two doesn't seem so far away.
Mm-hmm. And I think that you talked about it a little bit, but where do we start? What's a good starting place for this? Because we talked about, we're starting now to talk about, behaviors and related to value. So where do you start when you're kind of starting to break this out and talk about reporting, I guess, and how we're going to look at the things that we're tracking?
Yeah, we got to assume that in all organizations you have some level of talent acquisition reporting, but the RPO should really bring next level reporting and analytics to the client. So much like I mentioned previously, a deeper cut of reporting may reveal problem areas or opportunities for improved output. The bottom line is that reporting should really be designed to measure the outcomes desired by the client, values again. And it should really be held as talent acquisition best practices. The reports are designed to drive the behavior and the results, which are going to allow the client to succeed in their business goals. And it really moves beyond talent acquisition goals.
Got it. Now, okay, and I'm going to push a little bit now. Just for, can you give me like an example of the type of report, like just to make it clear, like that's driving maybe business. You said business results as opposed to just talent acquisition results. So give me an example of something that might, or type of report that might drive business results. Because I think we get fixated on this talent acquisition results, or or getting these numbers in this area, and that's great. But we're talking about the behavior now and these business results. So, do you have an example that's more like the business results?
Yeah, and again, bringing that theme of executive support and sponsorship back in, the best examples are those situations where when we've worked with clients, there is a clear connection between the business and talent acquisition. And the business understands how to use that talent acquisition team and the RPO partner to the fullest level. And so let me give you a real quick example. I'll change the names to protect the innocent, but we were actually working with a manufacturing company which had a really large sales staff, and one of our roles was to actually hire the salespeople, hire the salespeople, both in terms of the backfill, but as well as expansion of their sales team. So this organization, the business side, and with executive sponsorship, they determined that in order to hit their annual revenue numbers and their business goals, their sales team actually had to be staffed at 95% capacity. Anything below this would put extreme pressure on the ability of the organization to deliver those results. So due to the implications on the business, what they called, quote-unquote, quarterly fill rate was actually developed as a service level agreement. And so while the SLA performance was actually measured quarterly, so our performance was measured quarterly, we reported on this actually weekly. And the reason why we were looking at a more micro level of this was because we couldn't afford to get off track. So we actually designed a scorecard which was able to provide clarity by geographic region, by week, by month, by quarter, and then ultimately year to date. And this insight into this fill rate, along with on-target performance, allowed the client to actually trust and truly let go. It also helped that as part of a continuous improvement project, we went beyond just providing the scorecard. So what we did was we began to track trends in turnover and performance improvement plans and internal promotions by geographic region. And it was these trends which actually gave us insight into where to target our pipelining efforts. So here's a great example of where we move from reactive to proactive. And so knowing this type of information, all of the turnover information, again, performance improvement plans, things like that, internal mobility, gave us the type of information that allowed us to improve the quality of the talent, reduce our time to offer, and it improved hiring manager satisfaction scores as well. The goal, again, is to measure those things that the business and the talent acquisition team value. So developing service level agreements to target the most critical deliverables within the business is key.
See, I knew you had an example there. We didn't rehearse that even, did we? We never even talked about it. That's excellent. And one of the things that I love about Andy is, that experience that you get from doing a lot of these, when you're able to talk about examples like that, to give you a good example like that, I think is really priceless, because you learn from that experience, and that informs everything you do. So, when he's talking about those types of things, it's important that when you're doing tactical type stuff, and you're working on those talent acquisition, just some micro focus on those talent acquisition goals, sometimes you lose track of the bigger business goals and what's driving that. So that was a really good example of how if the sales team is key to getting your business done and to getting your business out there, that's where you have to know how you're going to report on that and how you're going to drive that accountability. So we're going to move along here when we're talking about this. There's probably a couple other things we can talk about here, but I want to, again, at the end here, talk a little bit more specifically about some things so that we'll give some perspective to, kind of the bigger ideas that we've been talking about today. So we've listed some of the metrics and service level agreement data points here, and there's a lot, and believe me, we've, in our experience, right, there's been, we can keep adding to this list, and there's always a new one or kind of a new spin, or, you see customers, just personally, like when you go into customer and ask what they're tracking, and they give you a list of 30 things, and then they tell you, well, really only these 2 are the ones we look at, or
right.
Nobody looks at these anymore. I don't know when this was last updated. So just, briefly kind of, Andy, focus on, what's most important to know about these metrics, maybe even not, any individual ones, but, you can speak to, if you want to speak to some individual ones that you like, but what's most important about, keeping in mind about these metrics?
Yeah, so first of all, this is a list, it's samples, and they don't apply to every company that's out there. So not unlike what I mentioned before about that, the quarterly fill rate for that company in my story, there's a different metric that is going to apply to the values of that particular client. And so these are simply the high-level or traditional types of metrics, data points, SLAs that a company may actually start with. You actually mentioned something actually kind of interesting, Matt, in that you said, in your conversations with clients and prospects, you said, I don't know the last time we tracked that. That's not unusual, because typically there's an evolution to what's actually going to be tracked based upon the growth and continuous improvement. So these things change over time. And companies and RPO providers should feel really comfortable with that.
Makes sense, and it speaks to that accountability. So, if you're in control, of that output and control of results, you're accountable for it. So that's what's really, driving some of these. A lot of the metrics you look at here, talk about, just kind of review mirror type stuff and looking back. Are there things that you look at to give us some foresight and look into the future?
Yeah, so let me give you one real quick example. It's called average rec age, and it's a real simple metric, easy calculation, which averages the age of all requisitions which are currently open. Now, this sounds as simple as it is, but ultimately, if you think about it, if all requisitions closed on the day of that data point, the time to fill metric would equal the average requisition age at that point in time. So understanding where your time to fill metric is going to end up can be easily understood by looking at your average rec age. So in other words, your time to fill will never be any better than your current average rec age. Now, if you trend average rec age over the course of the year, what you can actually see is the progress that the RPO partner is actually making at lowering the time to fill. The other cool thing that you can actually do with this data is you can plot both time to fill and average rec age on the same graph and look at them together and how they impact each other. So what you'll see is that when an aged rec actually closes, your time to fill number is going to spike up, but your average rec age is actually going to go down. And so that gives you a little bit of insight into the future. I think the other big thing, and specifically I know what we focus on, is our pipeline number and our talent community numbers. Our business is actually concentrated on higher-end exempt positions, a lot of engineering and IT professionals, and the demand for these candidates is really high. Skill sets are in short supply, and most of the quality candidates aren't actively looking for a new role. So it's not like low-hanging fruit to actually recruit these people. So it's our job to understand workforce trends and reach out to these candidates and pipeline them for future consideration. The strength of our talent community numbers gives us a level of insight into the success we're actually going to have with the future time to submit metric or interview to offer ratio.
So it makes sense. And yeah, and I can tell, when you're talking about it, right, you're kind of passion for it, and when we're talking about average requisition age, those are things like, that really obviously help you to drive those results and understand. I think the key thing that I got, when we've talked about this before, is how, you're using that data in an intentional way. So it's driving some of those to the ways you can look at how things are going and put them together maybe in different combinations and then advise the client what we think is happening here. One of those things, briefly, we want to leave a little time for questions. Just briefly talk about, we talked about, the hiring manager and some of the, whether there's success with the hiring manager or what they're doing. Can you give us an example of maybe a quick data point that might be used in an RPO partnership that measure maybe kind of closer to the performance of that hiring manager and or other departments and what's going on there?
Yeah, one of the things that happens, Matt, is in a lot of relationships, there's a focus on simply on reporting on an RPO's performance. A really great holistic view is to report on the performance of everybody that's involved in the actual process. So, and this goes with the theme of executive support, right, and executive sponsorship. So just a second ago, I mentioned interview to offer ratio, which can be used as both a really good barometer of candidate quality, but it also can give the client insight into the abilities or the selectivity of hiring managers. So for example, if you have a recruiter that is actually working with a number of different hiring managers, and this recruiter is on target with their quality levels, and let's just say that quality level is 3 interviews are needed for each one offer. But then you have one hiring manager that actually is at 5, 6, or 7 interviews to one offer. What we may know is that there may be an opportunity to provide guidance and training to this hiring manager. So running a report which actually stack ranks the hiring manager on this data point can really provide some interesting insight. Another common report to provide insight into hiring manager accountability that is used quite often is cancellation by department or business unit or even hiring manager, or by the hiring manager. What we know is cancellations of requisitions typically waste all stakeholders' time. So by measuring and providing trend analysis on this metric, it'll typically yield actionable results for you.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think there's an interesting one there, and I want to make sure that just kind of point this out and don't want to miss it, that, that was, looking at, accountability on all sides, and I think that can get missed in some of this a little bit. We talked about the accountability certainly of the RPO provider, but even on the hiring manager side and knowing what's going on there, and then providing that again that advice and possibility of training and things that to drive that, because that's what's going to drive the results. So understanding that. All right.
Exactly.
Lamise, I think we're kind of at the end of our timer. We've got maybe a couple minutes if there's any questions.
Sure. So I have one for you here. It's a good question from Jeff. He asked, how do you go about making the recruiters feel like the RPO is not a threat, but a strategic business partner?
Great question. That's all you, Andy.
Yeah, so a lot of this has to do with defining roles and responsibilities and understanding the value that those recruiters provide to the process. And so one of the things that we typically see in an RPO engagement is, and I talked a little bit about this earlier, when we talked about expertise and what to let go of, there's a level of expertise that the internal recruiters have about the company that surpasses what an RPO can have in the initial engagement. And so putting those recruiters in a place in which that can be capitalized on is a really positive way to use those resources. But it comes down, again, to leadership and directives and truly defining roles, responsibilities, and expected outcomes.
Yep, it makes total sense. And really making, again, like you said, each piece of this has a value. Each of these roles have a value, and defining those and making sure that, again, when we talked about it when we were talking about readiness, is understanding that and then capitalizing on it. Like you said, it could be really, really powerful. You don't want to lose that, and change is hard. So there are also standard change management practices that come into play there when you're implementing these types of things. So that totally makes sense. Louise, anything else?
Yeah, the next question is probably more general, and just for the sake of time, probably if we can limit the answer for 30 seconds each. Where do you see RPO going in the future?
So I'll start. I think
you got 30 seconds, Matt. Go.
30 seconds.
So here's the deal. I think the future is now, right, for RPO. I think that really what we're talking about is that this is a strategy that helps you to drive to the future. And if you integrate it into your process as well, you're going to be able to be prepared for the future and changes in your business. And I think that's the key. Andy, go.
Yeah, so let me just echo what you're saying. So, Matt, you just said future's now, and I would agree with that. I think RPO is an evolution of some tried but perhaps tired solutions that have been provided by outsourced providers previously. I mean, an agency is an outsourced provider, but not in the same type of partnership that an RPO engagement is typically based on the definition that we provided at the beginning. So the future is now. What we're going to see, though, is we're going to see more holistic solutions that span across, not just permanent hires, which RPO is typically focused on, but contingent workforce as well. And so those companies that are positioned to provide, soup to nuts, A to Z types of solutions and be that holistic provider is probably what we're going to see in the future. I think the other, because we're really out of time and it's top of the hour, one of the things that I wanted to close with and make sure that everybody knows is that, we still have the metrics and SLAs on the screen. All of these types of reports and metrics are really critical to providing the depth and insight needed to allow the client to, as Matt pointed out, trust and really feel confident and hopefully allow to let go. And hopefully some of the examples that we shared with you today let you see that by letting go, you actually allow the RPO partner to run as fast as possible and provide the best service possible. So there's a big value in trust and managing to outcomes versus tactics.
All right.
Okay, well, thank you both so much for the exceptional insight. We hope you enjoyed your time with us, and we hope you come back and present for the RPO again. And for our audience, thank you so much for being with us, and have a great day.